Welcome to office hours. I think a bunch of you have been at different ones of these or have seen recordings. But this is really just kind of part of this ongoing initiative to build a community around people that are thinking about game data. Magy and Erik and I are very actively working towards developing a proposal that will be part of what NSF calls research infrastructure. And to get this going, we've actually been granted an award to form that proposal and to build this community and figure out what the parameters of it really are. So we're really excited about trying to figure